Hey guys, welcome back to my channel for the second video in my history series, which after a lot of deliberation I've decided just to call a history series. I know, I think it sounds good. I don't know, that's what I'm calling it, so deal with it. This is my most requested video ever, like literally ever. I first mentioned possibly wanting to film this video way back in like the beginning of the year in my video on the doodler. Just mentioned it in passing, chilled, you know, and people have not shut up about it since. And every time I ask for like video requests, all I get is like Stonewall, Stonewall, Stonewall. So you'll be pleased to know that today I'm finally doing my video on Stonewall. And believe me, this is a video that I've really wanted to film for a really long time, but honestly I've just kept putting it off because the idea of it makes me really nervous. This is such an important story to me and to so many other people, and I just haven't wanted to mess up. But seeing as today, the day this video is going live, the 28th of June 2019, it is officially the 50th anniversary of Stonewall, so I thought what better time to film this than right now. So if you want to learn about what is arguably the most important landmark in LGBTQ+ history, then keep on watching. And I just want to preface this video by saying that there will be zero tolerance for hate in the comments. My channel is a safe space for the LGBTQ+ community. That is such a mouthful to keep saying. My channel is and always will be that safe space. So if you are thinking of leaving homophobic, transphobic, rude, mean, horrible comments down below, then maybe just consider like not, because I'll just delete the comment and then block you. So maybe just don't. If you are one of those people, then leave now. Or actually, maybe don't leave. Maybe carry on watching because you'll probably learn something really important. So before we really get into the story of Stonewall, the night that it all happened, June 28th, 1969, I think it's really important to give you guys a quick overview of LGBTQ+ history and the treatment of the community pre-Stonewall. Now this will be mostly focusing in on the USA because that is where this story takes place, so sorry if it's a bit USA heavy. I do intend to do like a whole series of these videos obviously, and if you want me to talk about a different part of LGBTQ+ history from any other part of the world, then just let me know in the comments. I intend to do it all eventually, but this video is mostly focusing on the USA because that's where Stonewall is. So I think gay rights can be split into two eras in the USA and across the entire world. These eras are pre-Stonewall and post-Stonewall. Whilst LGBTQ+ people today still do face many challenges in life, life before the Stonewall Uprising and Stonewall riots was unlike what most of us could even begin to imagine. 50 years ago, homosexual activity was illegal in pretty much every state across America. 50 years is not that long ago. That's within my parents' lifetimes, within probably all of our parents' lifetimes. In every single state but Illinois, which actually repealed its sodomy laws in 1961, if I'm correct, it was just illegal to be gay. I am going to be referring a lot to the word gay, homosexual in this video because that is pretty much what people refer to as, whether they were transgender, drag queens, cross-dressers. They were all sort of like lumped into one category here. So know that when I am talking about homosexual or gay in this context, I am referring to the community as a whole. Just the term transgender hadn't really been coined yet. It had, like, there were sort of like whisperings of the word, but it wasn't sort of a known word to the entire community. And the whole concept of being transgender just wasn't really understood by people. Even transgender people themselves didn't understand what it was they were feeling because they just didn't have that terminology. So just bear in mind when I'm talking about homosexuals in this context, I'm referring to the community as a whole. Gays, lesbians, bisexuals, transgender people, all were just considered homosexual. If we're focusing in on New York, which is where the story takes place, there's basically a web of local and state laws that just restricted the rights of gay people as much as they possibly could. This included things from like you couldn't dance in public with a same-sex partner, there was anti-sodomy laws, they criminalised private sexual acts between consenting partners, so even if it's two consenting people, you couldn't have sex, even if it was in your own private space. Wasn't allowed. There were even gender appropriate clothing laws which basically required people to wear a minimum of 3 pieces of clothing which were deemed appropriate for their gender. If you were found wearing the other gender's clothing, then you would get arrested. There were no federal laws or precedents which protected the civil rights of LGBTQ+ people across America. They could be fired from their job if it was revealed that they were gay, which shockingly is still legal today in some places in America. You can get fired simply for being gay or transgender, which disgusts me. Until 1973, homosexuality was actually listed in the American Psychiatric Association's manual as a mental disorder. Being gay was considered a mental illness. And many LGBTQ+ people truly believed that this was the case. They believed that they were mentally ill because that's what they'd been sort of raised being told. But not only did they believe they had this mental illness, but it was also illegal. Because of this, obviously, most of the community hid their sexual identity from the whole world around them. People would go on to get married, they would have kids, and never tell a single person that they were gay. And it sort of got to a point in later years where there were loads of these older people in their 60s and 70s finally coming out and living their true selves because their entire lives they've had to hide who they truly are. Weirdly, the 50s and 60s were a particularly bad time to be LGBTQ+ in America. From the beginning of the 20th century, acceptance of the community was actually kind of on the rise. It was becoming less of an issue for people to be gay. Obviously, it was still frowned upon, but it wasn't this huge issue like it became in the 50s and 60s. This is probably because in like the early 20th century, people had other things to worry about, like wars and everyone dying. So, you know, gay people were pretty low on their list of priorities. Throughout all of history though, LGBT acceptance has come in waves, which could actually be a really interesting video in itself, because some eras completely accepted gayness and others it was completely demonized. But in the 50s and 60s it got bad, mostly due to something called Mccarthyism. Now Mccarthyism, I'm just going to read from my notes quick, is the practice of making accusations of subversion or treason without any actual evidence. So basically just accusing people of stuff without really anything to back it up. It all came from this political repression after the wars and a huge fear of communism. People were terrified of the communists. Again, Mccarthyism and all this could be a whole video in itself, so I am like very much nutshelling here, but I just want to give you a quick overview. Basically, both homosexuals and Communist Party members were seen as subversive in American society. They were the antithesis of what officials thought a true American person should really be. Both were seen as big threats to the American way of life because in general homosexuals were a lot more left-leaning than the Republican government. They lived a more liberal life and therefore they were just like the communists and they were seen as invading the government. When Mccarthyism is just referred to homosexuals, this is called the Lavender Scare. Now, the Lavender Scare referred to a witch hunt and mass firings of homosexual people from the government in the 1950s. US government officials basically assumed that homosexuals were more likely to be blackmailed and they were in a more precarious position in the government and therefore they were more likely to side with the communists, or the communists were going to target the homosexuals because they were weaker. And this was basically just the excuse they used to fire all the homosexuals from the government. Only of course, if you were homosexual in the 50s, you probably weren't open about it. So it just became this witch hunt. Find the gays and get rid of them. Homosexuals were considered to be perverts by the government. In 1960, a Senate reported, and this is a direct quote, so I'm just going to read this from my notes for you. In further considering the general suitability of perverts as government employees, it is generally believed that those who engage in overt acts of perversion lack the emotional stability of normal persons. In addition, there is an abundance of evidence to sustain the conclusion that indulgence in acts of sexual perversion weakens the moral fibre of an individual to agree that he is not suitable for a position of responsibility. The same quote basically goes on to suggest that homosexuality is essentially spreadable, that if there's gays in the government then they will influence other people to be gay, especially these young and impressionable people looking up to the government, and therefore it's in everyone's best interest to get rid of these corrosive influences in the government. And what happens when there's no LGBTQ+ people in the government sort of keeping people accountable? Things just get worse. That went a little bit more in depth than I intended to when I started making the script, but hopefully that gives you an idea of how hated gay people were in society. Although sort of the main vein of Mccarthyism ended by the mid-50s, the Lavender Scare continued for many years. People were terrified of these homosexuals, thinking that if they sort of spoke to a homosexual and socialised with homosexuals, they would become gay themselves because it was spreadable. It was like a disease. So gay people in the 1960s, bad. Of course, Stonewall wasn't the first time that LGBTQ plus people like took a stand for themselves and like tried to protest. That had been going on for many, many years. There were loads of people across the country, or not loads, but there were people across the country trying to make these changes. But for some reason, Stonewall was the first time that people actually listened. So across the entire country, people were scared to admit to being gay. But one place where the community felt slightly safer was New York City, particularly the West Village, Greenwich Village. And this was basically just because that is where the gay people congregate. That is where you would find your community back in those days. And obviously if you're surrounded by people who are just like you, it's significantly less dangerous. And New York City, of course, has always been more liberal and more accepting than other places in the country. Although there were still these very strict laws in place, it just felt a bit safer. West Village sort of became this safe haven for the community, and I don't know how many of you have ever been to New York and been to the West Village, to Greenwich Village, but it is one of my favourite areas of the city. Even before I knew all this story, I've been going to New York for like 6 years now. It is my favourite place in the entire world, and there's just something about the West Village that is just so chilled. It's unlike any other vibe that you'll find in the city. It's kind of free of tourists, there's all these lovely coffee shops and restaurants. It just feels like a really homely, lovely place. So I'm not surprised that this is kind of where people congregated. And of course, nowadays when you're walking along the West Village, you can't walk more than about 5 metres without seeing a pride flag hung somewhere. Obviously though, that wasn't so much the case back in 1969. In the early 1960s, it was illegal for establishments to serve alcohol to homosexuals. Places that did so were considered to be disorderly. The SLA, the State Liquor Authority, refused to give licences to gay bars. If an establishment was found to be serving alcohol to homosexuals, they would have their licence revoked pretty much immediately. So because of this, many bars in New York just decided to stop allowing homosexuals in, full stop. The community was completely shunned. They had nowhere to go. I did actually read a source that said these laws about serving alcohol to homosexuals were overturned in 1966, but the stigma still stood. Many bars still refused to let homosexuals in because it was considered to be disorderly, they didn't want that kind of reputation, and so still just completely excluded from society. And this is where the mafia comes into the story. I bet you probably weren't expecting that. So the mafia obviously had a very strong presence in New York at the time, and they saw a business opportunity. They saw that the gays weren't allowed in any other bars, so they take it upon themselves, the mafia, to open up gay bars in New York City. They knew that this would mean they would definitely get business because these people had nowhere else to go. By the mid-1960s, mafia controlled the majority of gay bars in Greenwich Village, and in 1967 a man called Tony Laurier, also known as Fat Tony, decides to buy the Stonewall Inn on Christopher Street. The Stonewall Inn had been open since the 30s, I think it was, and it had mostly just been a restaurant and all that time, but when Fat Tony buys it, he closes it down, completely redoes it, and reopens it as a gay bar. The mafia are LGBT allies, who knew? Well, not really. It was all quite nuanced, and at the end of the day it was just all about money, and there was a lot of blackmail and fear involved in this. Fat Tony was very much involved in extortion. He would like to find the wealthy patrons of the Stonewall Inn who weren't public about their sexuality, because not many people were back in those days, and he'd basically blackmail them. He'd take photos of them in compromising positions, and he'd blackmail them for large sums of money. So the mafia, whilst they did a good thing by opening these gay bars, it wasn't necessarily for the best interests of the community. It's not very black and white at all. Fat Tony would bribe New York's 6th Police Precinct with $1,200 every month to turn a kind of blind eye to what was going on at Stonewall. Everyone knew that Stonewall was a gay bar, but just a little bit of bribery and the police would just pretend they weren't entirely sure. To circumvent all the liquor licence laws, Stonewall Inn basically operated under the guise of a private bottle club. Basically a private club for members only. This is something that a lot of New York gay bars did at the time. For some reason, private clubs just didn't fall under the same laws as the rest of them, and therefore they didn't require a liquor license. To maintain this illusion of exclusivity, you would have to sign your name in a book when you went into the Stonewall Inn, like you were members. But of course a lot of people use pseudonyms because you don't want to out yourself by writing your real name on this piece of paper as you're entering a gay club. Not just for fear of being found out, but if you were found out to be gay, you would get arrested. When you approached the door of the Stonewall, a bouncer would basically open a peephole, and you would only be allowed in if they recognised you or if you were like obviously gay. So to get into these bars, these people would have to like kind of out themselves on the street to then be allowed in, and then just have to like rely that the bouncers would recognise you next time. This was basically their way of stopping undercover police from coming into the bar. The entrance fee on weekends was $3 a night, which was pretty expensive back in the 60s, but this could be exchanged for 2 drinks. But of course the alcohol that was served inside the bar, inside the clubs as well, was also crazy expensive. It was all watered down and it would be served at top shelf prices because the mafia knew that these people had no other choice but to buy it. Hygiene and safety at the Stonewall Inn were also very, very lax. There was no fire exit, there was just like one door that everyone would have to squeeze through if there was a fire. The bartenders didn't have access to running water behind the bar, so they'd just have to serve drinks again and again in the same used dirty glasses. There was actually an outbreak of hepatitis in the West Village in the 60s, and this was very much blamed on Stonewall, just spreading it through all of these dirty glasses. So you win some, you lose some. The Stonewall Inn gave the community somewhere they felt they could go, somewhere they felt free, somewhere they could be themselves. And Stonewall, a lot of people said, was one of the only places you could actually find love. Most gay bars didn't allow dancing because even though they were gay bars, that was still too far. But the Stonewall did allow dancing, so you could slow dance with your loved one if you wanted to. It's just a great place to find love rather than a quick hookup on the street, which is what most people were accustomed to. Stonewall was also one of the only gay bars that allowed drag queens, and possibly a lot of these people would have been transgender, but at the time they were just being referred to as drag queens. And most of the other gay bars, drag queens were considered the lowest of the low. They were very much frowned upon, but at Stonewall, everyone was kind of accepted. But despite the police payoffs, Stonewall wasn't entirely exempt from the state law, and there were regular raids. The payoffs just meant that before they were raided, somebody at Stonewall, usually Fat Tony, was alerted to the fact that there was going to be a raid beforehand, so they would sort of hide their extra sachets of alcohol and warn people. The mafia rarely kept all of their alcohol in their bars. They'd keep a small amount at the bar and then hide the rest of it, either like in sort of holes in the wall, or they'd keep the alcohol in cars outside. So if there was a raid and all the alcohol was confiscated, they could just immediately reopen again. At Stonewall, there were actually 2 dance floors, 2 kind of bars. The walls were all painted black, there were pulsing lights, so it was like a proper club place that you could go and dance. If the police were spotted, regular white lights would come on, signalling to everyone that they had to stop dancing, stop touching, and just act calm. So on June 24th, 1969, the police turned up at Stonewall and they arrest some of its employees and take a large stash of Stonewall's alcohol. It was basically targeted that night for operating without a proper licence. But this wasn't enough for the police. The police wanted the place shut down. The police basically said that it was because of the alcohol liquor licence law breaking thing, but late information actually showed that the police were pissed off because they basically found out that Fat Tony was using extortion to get money from his guests, and Fat Tony was actually making more money from this extortion, from this blackmail, than they were from anything else. And the police didn't like this because they weren't seeing any of this money, and so the police decided they're just going to shut the place down. And then comes June 28th, 1969. It's 1:20 AM when 4 plainclothes police officers, 2 like uniformed officers and 2 detectives, or detective and a deputy inspector, turn up at Stonewall. They announce, "Police, we're taking the place." Employees were surprised because on this particular occasion they weren't tipped off to any raids happening. This was a complete shock to them. Early that evening, somehow 2 undercover police women and 2 undercover police men had somehow got into the bar, and they'd been in there gathering visual evidence, and they'd alerted to the police outside that they were ready for the raid to take place. So everyone inside are alerted to the police coming in, the lights go up, the music stops, and police instructs everyone to get into the lines and show their IDs. There are about 205 people in the bar that night. But many people in that bar hadn't been present for a police raid before, and they start to panic a little bit. Obviously, they're in a gay bar, that's illegal. And so whilst the police are sort of shouting at everyone to get in line, show their IDs, they've barred the doors so nobody can get out, and there's just this sort of sense of panic arising within everyone. Standard procedure was to take all of the patrons, line them up and check each and every ID. And if the police weren't convinced about somebody's gender identity, the female officers would take them into the bathroom and would literally just violate them, pat them down, touch their areas to see what genitals they had, and if they were not the gender that they were presenting themselves as, then they would get arrested. A sense of unrest and discomfort begins to spread throughout the bar. Police begin to assault some of the lesbians by touching them inappropriately whilst frisking them. Those who were not arrested that night were eventually allowed out of the front door, but they don't go very far. Usually people would just scatter, they'd go back to wherever they were living at the time. Most of them were actually homeless. So many of the people were living in the parks on benches. But that night, people don't scatter, they don't run away, they just stand outside. A crowd starts to form. Within minutes, there's 100 to 150 people congregated outside the Stonewall Inn. Some of them were expelled patrons from the bar, some of them were people who were just passing, some of them were people who lived nearby who heard the commotion. The police were to transport all of the bar's alcohol to the station in a patrol wagon. So that night they seized 28 cases of beer and 19 bottles of hard liquor. But the wagons hadn't arrived yet, so the police just sort of like stood in the bar with all these people they were arresting, with all these people stood outside, with all this alcohol they were waiting to take, and they had nowhere to go, nothing to do. So they just sort of like waited, and in this time people started to get a little bit frustrated. Something snapped that night. These people who were completely downtrodden in society, most of them living below the poverty line, who were constantly degraded and humiliated by law enforcement, by society, just all simultaneously decided that they'd had enough. Alongside being gay, queer, whatever they wanted to identify as, poor, a huge amount of these people were also people of colour. They had it very, very hard in society, and life was hard, and they'd had enough. Eventually the wagons arrive and police start escorting people to the wagons. They put the mafia members in first and employees in second. The crowd were restless, some were cheering, some were booing. And then the police begin to take the customers out. They're taking the customers out one by one, putting them in the back of the wagons, and they don't do anything, they just like put them in the back. And as the police turn their back, these people are just like getting out and just heading into the crowd. And the crowd are seeing this, seeing these people just like walking away from the police, and it's getting them excited. The police like truly believe that these people could just be put in the back of a car and left alone, and they'd just sit there. They didn't expect people to fight back and actually defy their orders. This began the first little baby steps of rebellion here. The mood then turns darker when the police push one of the queens. She turns around and hits the police officer with her purse, and the police officer then takes the baton and starts beating her, and at this point the crowd are getting angry. Now there's a bit of a question over the next part of the story. There's a lot of different witness accounts that say different things about how the whole thing really started, but the widely accepted course of events is this. Cops bring out a butch lesbian in handcuffs called Stormy de Lavender, and she's basically complaining that her handcuffs are too tight, and so a police officer hits her round the head with a baton. But Stormy won't go down without a fight, and she fights back, and she continues fighting with them as they're trying to drag her towards this police car. She's having none of it. Some recall her shouting to the crowd, "Why don't you guys do something?" And at this moment, as she says that, an officer grabs her and throws her in the back of a car. And at this point, the crowd lose it. They start to throw coins, they start to throw beer bottles, they start to fight back to the police. Police attempt to gain control of the crowd, they start beating people, they start threatening arrest, but they're simply overpowered. There's about 10 police officers there if you're counting the ones who are undercover in the bar at the beginning, and there were well over 100 people in the crowd at this point. At one point the police try to call back up, but none are sent. As the crowd gets rousier and angrier, the police actually have to retreat back into the bar, closing and locking the door behind them. The tables had turned, and now the police were the ones who were scared. Now it does remain a matter of dispute as to who threw something first. However, it's generally acknowledged that the street youth fought the hardest because they had nothing to lose. These people were queer, mostly people of colour, and they were living on the streets. They had no money, they were just in complete poverty. And so they fought, because what was the worst that was going to happen? They'd maybe get to spend a night in jail, a nice warm bed inside. They're gonna fight. Now, it's very widely thought that Marsha P Johnson is the one who started the riot. This was something that I thought for a very long time, because most of the sources you read about Stonewall, most of the things you watch, cite that Marsha P Johnson started this. She was a person of colour, a black drag queen as she was known at the time. A lot of people always said that she was the first one to throw something. She was one of the vanguards of the Stonewall uprising. But Marsha actually denies this herself. She says that she didn't turn up at the Stonewall riots until after 2 AM when it was already in full swing. A lot of people say that she threw the first brick. It may be true, it may not, but regardless, Marsha became one of the icons of the Stonewall uprising. The name Sylvia Rivera is also a name that you'll see pop up quite often as well. She is also considered to be one of the main people that started Stonewall. I think Stormy, Marsha and Sylvia are like the three names that you will see the most when you're reading about Stonewall. Some sources again say that she was a really vital part of the uprising. Some say that she wasn't even there at all on the first night. But what we can be sure of is that people of colour played a vital role in this. People of colour started this revolution, Stormy being a black woman herself. And all three of them would go on to do incredible things with the platform they were given. The crowd uprooted a parking meter, literally pulled it out of the street and started trying to break down the door of the bar with it. They wanted to get to the police inside. They were setting things alight, they were throwing things at the bar, beer bottles, cobblestones, coins, anything they can find, they're throwing it at the building. This is years and years of repression and anger just coming out. One protester at the scene was quoted as saying, "I was sick of being told that I was sick." Eventually, fire trucks and officers arrived from all of the local precincts, as well as officers from the NYC's tactical police force, who were specifically equipped to deal with riots. They put out the fires, they rescued the officers trapped inside the bar, and by this point the crowd though had swelled even more. There were just more and more people joining at every single moment. Some estimate there were between 500 and 1,000 people there on that first night. After all the backup arrives, 13 people are arrested at the scene for disorderly conduct and they're taken to the station. But for the most part, the riot, or the uprising as many people like to call it, continued on. Police tried to get it under control, but at this point there were literally so many people in the crowd that the crowd were just chasing the police away and there was nothing more they could do. It continued until about 4 AM. In multiple different accounts, the police expressed their astonishment that the community fought back at all. They were used to the homosexuals living in shame, in the shadows, in fear of being found out. They were stereotypically effeminate and passive, and it was an absolute shock to the police when that night they weren't passive, they stood up for what they believed in and they fought back. It was just absolutely inconceivable to them that the homosexuals would stand up for themselves. Like I said, the riot continued that night on the 28th of June until about 4 AM and then the next night it continues. Now on this second night, it's quite widely thought that Marsha P Johnson actually climbed a lamppost with a very heavy bag filled with bricks, and she drops this bag off the top of this lamppost right onto the windshield of a police car, shattering it. Now this second night saw an even larger crowd than the first because there had been a huge leafleting campaign all throughout that day, all throughout June 28th. There were two people called Craig Rodwell and Frank Sargent who printed and distributed 5,000 leaflets across the West Village and the surrounding areas in New York, basically reading like get the mafia out and the cops out of gay bars. They called for gays to own their own establishments, for a boycott of all the mafia owned bars, and they wanted people to put pressure on the mayor's office. This was the first time that anything like this had ever really been seen, and it drew a huge crowd in on that second night. The LGBTQ+ community themselves, hippies, civil rights protesters, even tourists turned up to fight. This second demonstration wasn't as rowdy, wasn't as violent as the first. It was more political because now they had a message that they wanted to get out there. Equality. This continues on for 4 days after that. The riots went on for 6 days in total. It was the first time that the entire LGBTQ+ community had sort of come together for a common cause. Usually it was transgender people, the gays, the lesbians, all fighting for their own rights. They'd never really joined together to fight for united rights before, but now they were one and it was a lot more powerful. Monday and Tuesday were quieter days due to the rain, but there were definitely still things happening. And on Wednesday, which was the final night of the riot, it definitely ramps up a notch again. The Village Voice had run reports of the riot that day, and it was just overall a very offensive article. It painted the whole community in a very unflattering light, said it was violent and that they were like embarrassing, and it was basically everything that the community were fighting against. And so a mob descends on Christopher Street once again, this time threatening to burn down the offices of the Village Voice. This demonstration lasted for an hour and led to the arrest of 5 more people. In total, over the course of the week, 21 people were arrested and nobody died. Nobody died at Stonewall. A famous quote reads, "The word is out, Christopher Street shall be liberated. The fags have had it with oppression." Something changed that week. These people who had felt oppressed for their entire lives now felt empowered for the first time in their lives. They refused to let things go back to how they were. They're here, they're queer, and they're not going anywhere. The police and the media actually tried to put the riots down to the death of Judy Garland, who had died on the 22nd of June, and her funeral was held on the 27th. And basically the media said that the gays were so upset about Judy Garland dying that they just were acting out. This is kind of borderline offensive, or not even borderline, it's just offensive, and it was just a way to avoid talking about the actual problem, the oppression, the treatment of the gay community. Not a single eyewitness account from the night at Stonewall says that a single person ever mentioned the name Judy Garland. Within a matter of weeks, the fallout from the riot tore through all of the existing homophile organisations. Homophile was the 1960s term for what we would now call like LGBTQ+ organisations. It used to be called homophile organisations. With this newfound bravery off the back of Stonewall, new radical groups were formed at an unprecedented pace. There were these huge demands for equality that people hadn't seen before. Homophile magazines began to pop up, attracting tens of thousands of readers. Of course, things didn't change immediately. It remains illegal to be gay, the cops continued harassing the gay communities, and the raids carried on. But for the first time in their lives, the people felt like there was something that could be done. And that was enough. It was a turning point. And we're not talking about just New York. This like ripped through the entire country and then the world. Similar protests started happening in San Francisco and Los Angeles. Things like kiss-ins at restaurants that refused to serve LGBTQ+ people. It was just a peaceful protest, and then there were of course non-peaceful protests. There were things like on-air interruptions of popular programmes. People would literally hack into these stations and pass on their message. From Stonewall came the Gay Liberation Front, the GLF, and it was formed within weeks of the Stonewall uprising, and it would actually go on to begin to form what we now know as the first ever Gay Pride March. The Gay Liberation Front didn't last very long. It was a very strong organisation whilst it was like at its peak, but at the end of the day it only really lasted I think a few months, maybe even just like a year, because everyone was just sort of like arguing between themselves. But at the time, it was a good thing. Pride back then was called the Christopher Street Liberation Day. Exactly 1 year on from the uprising, so June 28th, 1970, people assembled on Christopher Street. They marched from Christopher Street all the way up to Central Park. That's 51 blocks. Whilst the crowd was overwhelmingly LGBTQ+, there were actually people there from all walks of life, like even allies, tourists. Everyone just turned up. At some points, the march was so big that they took up entire streets for 15 blocks. This is the first ever Pride March, and it attracted that much attention. Now, they actually thought the march was going to last an hour, couple of hours. It actually ended up taking less than half of that time because people were A, so excited that they were just like running through the streets, but B, they were scared. They were running through the streets with like banners and signs, sort of just outing themselves. They were scared they were going to get either beaten up or arrested in the street. So like people literally ran this march, but it was something. Simultaneously, marches happened in LA and Chicago. The next year in 1971 it happened again, but this time there were also marches in Boston, Dallas, Milwaukee, London, Paris, West Berlin and Stockholm. Every single year more and more cities would join in on this Liberation Day, which would become to be known as Pride. At the time that Stonewall happened, there were between 50 to 60 underground gay groups across the country, across the USA. A couple of years after Stonewall, there were now 2,500 gay groups fighting for their rights. By 1972, Democratic presidential hopefuls spoke favourably of anti-discrimination laws. It was the first time that people actually in government were turning around and saying, like, actually, maybe there should be more protections for these people. Although it would take in the end until 2003, that's right, 2003, for the Supreme Court ruling to state that same-sex sexual activity was legal across the country. Of course, in like the years previously, single states had brought in their own laws, but it was 2003 that the Supreme Court actually said, no, like, this is now going to be legal across the entire country. In the UK, it was actually in 1967, so 2 years before Stonewall, that the Sexual Offences Bill decriminalised homosexual acts between two men over the age of 21 in private in England and Wales. I think it was 81 and 82 that it was passed in Scotland and Northern Ireland. So although by the time that Stonewall happened in England and Wales it was actually not illegal for two men to have sex, it actually took, I think it was until 2001 that the age of consent was lowered to 16, so like the same as straight couples. And fun fact, it was never actually technically illegal to be lesbians in the UK because nobody had the heart to tell Queen Victoria when she was making these laws that lesbians existed. So all of the laws around homosexuality in the UK always just referred to like male and male relationships. Same-sex marriage, of course, has recently been legalised in England, Wales and Scotland. Still not allowed in Northern Ireland, which is really, really sad. That was in 2014, and in the USA it was legalised in 2015. But like, that's very, very recent, guys. There's still a long way to go. Of course, Stonewall didn't fix everything overnight. There was still this huge mountain to climb, but it was the beginning of a revolution. It was baby steps to where we are today. And there is still half the mountain to climb. We're not entirely there when it comes to equality, but we're working towards it. I mean, especially when it comes to transgender rights. The statistics when it comes to transgender people being murdered in the USA is absolutely shocking, and these people are overwhelmingly people of colour, and nobody really seems to be doing anything about it. And of course, these transgender people being murdered just comes down to a lack of understanding. It comes down to bigotry and hatred. And I think with education, that could be fixed. If people are educated from a young age about the LGBTQ+ community, if same-sex couples are included in sex education, if people learn about transgender people, then that fear would slowly go away. But until that happens, I think people are always going to be scared. Scared of what? I don't know. Scared of people who are different. That's pretty much it. But education is where it needs to start. Education with children. People love to ask, why do they even need Pride anymore? And I do kind of hope this video has answered some of those questions if you're one of those people who's ever thought that. It would be easy for a straight person to look at LGBTQ+ people from the outside and assume they've got rights, assume that everything's happy, everything's good. I don't see you being beat up in the streets, so it's fine. Why do you even need Pride? But it's not something you'll ever understand until you've lived it, until you face the discrimination. In some parts of the world, it's still illegal to be gay. You'll still get beaten up and killed in the streets for being gay, for being transgender. That's something that happens. And even in more Western countries, even across USA, UK, Canada, you see these things still happening. Not as often, it's maybe not as dangerous as it is in, say, Nigeria, but these things happen and it is still dangerous. I mean, there was that article about two lesbians, or I think one of them was bisexual, being beaten up on a bus by a group of teenage boys because they were gay. And that was in London a month ago. Straight people don't get beaten on the streets for kissing a loved one. Gay people do. Transgender people get murdered just for being transgender. Until those things don't happen anymore, That's why we need pride. Stonewall was a trigger for an entire movement. I mean, before Stonewall, people were already fighting for their rights. There were already protests and demonstrations happening. But something about Stonewall caught public attention, and this is what had an effect. People heard about it and the message got out there, and people refused to let it be forgotten. It wasn't Stonewall itself that made the difference. It was the people's actions afterwards, their refusal to give up on what is right. Stonewall was actually shut down after the riots, and over the following like 20-30 years it was a variety of different establishments. I think it was a shoe shop, a Chinese restaurant, a bagel shop, very New York. And it wasn't until the early 1990s when part of it, I think the west side of the original Stonewall Inn, was actually bought and it was made into a bar again. But over the next few years there was loads of things about like noise complaints, and it got shut down and reopened and shut down and reopened. It was actually in March 2007 when it was officially reopened again as the Stonewall Inn, and it became a landmark for the LGBT community, and this was like, it was opened again as the original Stonewall Inn. In June 2016, President Obama declared the inn itself and the surrounding area a national monument, the first ever LGBT national monument. It was also declared a state historic site that very same year. Every single time I go to New York, I make sure I make a visit to the Stonewall Inn. If you're ever in New York, in the West Village area, I would highly recommend just go in there, have a drink, and just take in the history that happened in that spot. It's really incredible. Whenever I go with a friend, I make sure I go and sit them in Christopher Park next to the monument, and I tell them the story. I tell them what happened at Stonewall, and none of my friends have ever heard of it until I've shared the story. And that's what this series is for. That's my aim, to share important moments in history that you probably don't know about, but you probably should. Just a few weeks ago, so just before the 50th anniversary of Stonewall, the NYPD actually issued a formal statement stating that the actions taken by the NYPD were wrong. Plain and simple. They were wrong. So hopefully when you go to Pride this year, whether you're an LGBTQ+ person yourself, if you're straight, whether you're just simply an ally, remember that this is why we have Pride. It's not a party, it's a protest. I mean, sure, go, drink, have fun with friends, but make sure you know the history behind it, know why you're there, know why Pride is a thing, and maybe share the story as well with the people that you go with, and have fun, of course. And I think with that, this video is now over. I know I didn't cover every single little thing about the Stonewall riots. I'm sure there's more information that some of you guys can share with me down below. Please feel free, more information is always a good thing, but I was pretty happy with that script and how that went, so hopefully you guys are as well. And I really hope that you learned something. This is just one of my favourite, feels weird to say my favourite events in history because it came from such a bad thing, but I think it's such an important event in history. Maybe that's what I should say. This is, for me, one of the most important events in history. Make sure you subscribe to my channel if you enjoy what I'm doing here on my channel. I do midweek mystery videos every single Wednesday. I do a history video as and when I feel like it. Maybe it seems to be every 6 weeks. And I do a serial killer spotlight video on the last Saturday of every single month, and other videos as well. Whenever I feel like, I just do whatever I want on this channel, and you guys seem to enjoy it for the most part, so that's what I do. If you want to support my channel, then my Patreon will be linked down below, as well as my merch store where I'm selling pins and phone cases, and I really like them, they're really cute. So if you want to go see them, I just like nearly choked on my own spit, that'll be linked down below. So I'm gonna go. Thank you so much for watching. Bye guys.